Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Just recently I was asked a question by a young person. What actually is the evidence for creation? Can we have any evidence, for creation itself as opposed to evidence that evolution is impossible? And my reply was, well, the account of creation that is in the Bible is really the only reasonable account that we have for the origin of the earth and the universe. Papers have been published purporting to explain how, first life formed and this sort of thing from chemicals. But when we actually look at the chemistry of those claims, we find, yes, they don't work. So there's lots of evidence that evolution is impossible, that life couldn't form by chance. But in terms of the actual account of creation, the only evidence we have is the evidence that's been preserved for us in the Bible. And of course, when we think about it, that Noah's son Shem was still alive during Abraham's time. And so a lot of the material about creation, which would have been passed down through the patriarchs, would have been available there. As a matter of fact, Noah only died a few years before Abraham was born. But when we look at actual scientific evidence, for me, one of the strongest evidences is that the surface of the earth is young and civilizations are young. So to me, and there's evidence that the surface of the earth is only thousands of years old. And this, of course, fits in with the flood account that about 4,500 years ago, or thereabouts, about 2,500 BC, there was the global flood, a catastrophic destruction of the surface of the earth, with only a few survivors. That was Noah and his wife and their three sons and their wives. And from that family group, the earth repopulated. And of course, we have the evidence for that. So it's quite fascinating that, of course, we inherit mitochondrial DNA from our mothers, and there are three main groups of mitochondrial DNA. So just little subtle things like this confirm the biblical account as being, highly accurate. And of course, some people say, well, the Bible isn't meant to be a science textbook. But the thing is that it still is correct. It doesn't have to explain things, and it's not meant to give a scientific explanation. But the facts that it states still should be scientifically correct. And that's what we find. And that's why I'm so enthusiastic about the Bible, because there are so many aspects of this that demonstrate that the Bible is, scientifically correct. Now, there was a chapter titled Evidences of a Youthful Earth in a book that was published a few years ago now in 2005. It was called Origin by Design, and the authors were Harold Coffin, Robert Brown, and R. James Gibson. And so that was published in 2005. And in this chapter, in this book was this chapter, Evidences of a Youthful Earth. And I think it's actually gave quite a lot of very insightful evidences which very strongly suggest recent creation. And when talking about creation, we think, well, if the flood account is correct, then that is powerful evidence that the biblical account of creation is also going to be correct. When, of course, in school and on, notice boards in national parks and that, we are all the time told about how old the Earth is and that it takes millions of years to build mountains or to erode canyons and so forth. But when we actually look at the evidence, it doesn't point to great ages. And the author of that particular chapter was Dr. Harold Coffin, and he had a PhD in zoology, but he did he was a creationist, and he did quite a lot of primary work, particularly in the area of Spirit Lake after the Mount St Helens eruption, and saw what was happening there. And he was the main contributor to this chapter, and he's written a number of different articles, and he points out that natural processes, for example, will destroy cliffs in time. And so rocks and little overhangs, they break off the cliffs because of erosion. And of course, freezing and thawing can cause cracking in rocks. As water, when it goes below 4 degrees, it begins to expand. And so water trapping is trapped in the rocks, and the surface can freeze over first. And then as it gradually freezes further into the rock, it's trapped there. As it expands, it can actually crack rocks apart. And, of course, then there's also earthquakes. And so the products of these erosions accumulate at the bottom of cliffs. And if these cliffs were actually millions of years old, as acclaimed, they would have eroded away. They would have the cliffs wouldn't be there, particularly, with the sharp edges and the steep mountain sides that we often see in places like New Guinea and the Himalayas. And the other thing is that also this material runs down and it will fill up lakes. So lakes will fill up. And the other thing is too with lakes that plants that grow along the margins of lakes, the edges of lakes, gradually push in towards the centre. So they accumulate soil and they grow a little bit further, accumulate some soil. And skeletons living in the water will accumulate on the bottom, and trees and leaves and other materials fall in to the water. So after a while, lakes will fill up. So these claims that many of these lakes are going to be millions and hundreds of millions of years old, again, just doesn't work because they would fill up. One of the examples, for example, that Dr. Harold Coffin gives in his book is that in New England, area of the United States, early settlers rowed their boats across lakes where there are now meadows. And he points out that when you look at the rates at which lakes sediment up and change back into land, the fact that there are lakes all over the surface of the world is actually a very good sign that the surface of the earth is young. And there are lakes in more southerly areas that we know were formerly covered by glaciers. And they would have readily become marshes or meadows if hundreds of thousands of years had passed since their formation. I was interested to read when I was reading the article that there's a river that flows into the Adriatic Sea in Europe that's called the Po River, P-O River. And it's on the east side of the Italian boot, that shape of Italy that's a bit like a boot. And, of course, there's a lot known about the history in that area because, we had the Roman Empire in that area and Greek history before that. And he points that we can actually trace the growth of this delta from historical and archaeological records. And what has happened is that sites that were once directly on the coast are now several kilometres inland. And the present protruding delta has built out into the sea since 1000 BC. And so again, as we look at the Po River, it deposits some sediments and that some of these sediments are spread along the upper edge of the Adriatic, there's no way that the Po and its delta building activity can be more than a few thousand years old. So when we look at these examples, it's really, really strong evidence. I think I mentioned before that my wife and I have been to Ephesus, and when you look there, that city that was once, beside the sea is several kilometres again inland now. It's changed so much. And yet, the amphitheatre and the road and some of the houses and the streets along which, Mark Antony and Cleopatra would have walked are still there, and Paul would have taught and so forth. So when we look at these examples, and these examples we can go and measure, we've got a lot of evidence for, they actually don't fit with the ideas of uniformitarian geology that require the deltas of the world's rivers to be much larger and much older than they actually are. And of course, but that's again what the students are taught. Sediments are also accumulating in the ocean basins. Now, these sediments, there we have, there's dissolved substances raw being washed into the sea. There's solid material and runoff, continuous from the islands and continents. And again, there's remains of organisms that lived and died in the oceans themselves, as well as glacier and iceberg transported sediments and windblown dust and so forth, seashore erosion, volcanic eruptions, and there's even meteorite dust. And at the present time, when we look at all these things, we see that if the Earth was really as old as it's claimed to be, that even the oceans would fill up. And the oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface, but they have an average depth of nearly 5 times the average height of the land above the sea. And so really the land area would, if it was really that old, would have eroded down to sea level long before the sea basins became full. So again, when we look at the data that we have, all these things again are pointing to a young Earth. There's lots of fascinating things. There's other things, of course. Geologists claim that there were 150 million years that the continents have been breaking apart. They would have provided sufficient time for land areas to erode to sea level, 10 or 12 times. So, as we say, when we look at the standard geological model, you've got these continents moving apart over 150 million years, but yet they would have eroded away in probably less than 10 million years, or around 10 million years. So, again, when we look at this data, to me, it's all adds up. And there's data from all around the world. For example, the present rate of runoff would have buried the whole Gulf of Mexico with sediments in 6 million years. The Mississippi River alone could have eliminated the whole of the Gulf in 10 million years. But yet the Gulf of Mexico is largely open. So again, we have this evidence right in front of us that these structures that we see, like the Gulf of Mexico and so forth, that have these massive rivers flowing into them, like the Mississippi, can't be the hundreds of millions of years old that the standard geology textbooks require for their model of the age of the Earth. And that's something that we need to consider, in that the textbooks are based on a particular model, and this model is saying that the lowest fossil-bearing rocks, the Cambrian, 550 to 600 million years old. But we know, as we can see from this erosion data, which is extensive all over the world, and we have the examples there, that the surface just can't be that old. But yet they require these times because they want really, really long ages for the evolution of the so-called evolution of all the different types of animals that they find, and creatures and plants and so forth they find further up what is called the geological column. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is that while the continents still rise above sea level quite high, and the basins are largely unfilled, this really throws into question the existence of the continents and the oceans for hundreds of millions of years. So that's the other side. This whole model that has this picture of these continents and oceans being as they are for hundreds of millions of years just doesn't fit anymore. The other aspect is the absence of major erosion in the geologic column itself is a striking feature of its structure. If we look at the way that people draw the geological column, and I've talked about this before, when you look at the strata in the Grand Canyon, you see all these parallel surface layers there. The long periods of time had transpired between the strata. Weathering and erosion should have broken up the lower strata. And yet these sort of irregularities are very rare to find anything like that. And any sort of erosion that is seen is sort of very, very minor. And so again, these millions of years that the standard geologic literature claims really doesn't fit the evidence that we can go out and observe. The other reason for young Earth may be provided by humanity itself. One of the things that Dr. Coffin talks about is the known rates of increase in human population. And it doesn't seem possible for humans to have occupied the Earth for several million years. Also, when we study the history of language and the history of agriculture, it goes back just a couple of thousand years before Christ, about 4,000 years ago, and then suddenly it disappears. And of course, sometimes now we find people trying to find and carbon-14 date some of these older things. But really, when we look at the history that we can depend on goes back about 4,000 years, and then, just suddenly stops. And when we look at the carbon-14 dating, of course, we know that's very iffy, it can't be properly calibrated, and there's lots of reasons why any long ages that we get there really need to be calibrated in terms of much shorter time periods, because the carbon-14 levels at that time are unknown. They're affected by cosmic ray flux, which is affected by this magnetic field and all these other unknowns. The other thing, of course, is that when we look at the fossils, there are many plants that appear in the fossil record that are living today. One of the classic ones are the ginkgo. And the ginkgo plant, and perhaps many people take ginkgo extract. It's supposed to improve circulation of the blood and particularly to the brain. And of course, these were primitive, regarded as primitive trees and prehistoric trees. And of course, they've found living specimens, of course, of the ginkgo were found. Now they're grown in various places around the world. Nearby to where I live, we have the Wollombi pines, again, which were pine trees, or types of pine that were believed to be extinct and existed hundreds of millions of years ago. But living specimens have been found in these very steep, walled canyons that are only about 100 kilometres away from where I live. And when, again, you see these canyons, the sides of these canyons are virtually vertical, and they're quite narrow. They might be only 50 metres across, something like that. So they're very narrow canyons, and of course that's why the trees have been preserved, in that they're in these sunken canyons in the mountains, and they've been protected from bushfires and this sort of thing that can ravish, Australia, and also from people chopping them down because they were very, very difficult to get to. You had to abseil into these canyons. And so here again, the fact that we find these living fossils of these trees again points to a young Earth. In the town of Thermopolis, that's Thermopolis in Wyoming, in the United States, there's a large hot spring emerges from the ground and flows into the Bighorn River nearby. And local inhabitants began using this water in the city park, for example, back in 1905. Now, it's interesting that a particular compound, travertine, from the minerals in the water that flowed from the top of the pipe has formed a tent-shaped dome around the pipe. And it's now, or when this article was written about 15 years ago, it's reached a height and width of about 20 feet. And this dome even has a couple of small caves with stalactites inside. And so here we know that these caves, this whole structure with stalactites and stalagmites and cave, it has stalactites inside rather, has formed in about 100 years, less than 100 years. In Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, famous caves down there, large pillars in what's called the New Cave. And it's interesting that under some of these pillars, these giant pillars in the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, park staff have found Indian projectile points. And so when the water drips from the ceiling of the cave, these stalactites may form from the ceiling, and where some evaporation occurs before the drop falls. And then, of course, on the floor, stalagmites may grow. So you remember stalactites from the top, mites from the bottom. And these pillars in the new cave were 2 to 3 feet in diameter and about 15 feet tall. And so, again, the fact that they find these Indian artefacts there limits the amount of time for these large pillars to form. Looking at the airflow, and we know now that these sort of stalactites and stalagmites, which were once thought to be indicators of great age, can now form, very quickly. Matter of fact, I've seen stalactites form from minerals being leached from the concrete floors under the eaves of university buildings that were less than 50 years old. And so I guess when we look at the fact now that we've found the soft tissue in dinosaur remains, when we put all this together, we have this overall evidence that the surface of the Earth is very young. We've got the widespread lakes, we've got the as I've mentioned previously in some of the previous talks, the lack of accumulation of rubble and sediments at the bottom of cliffs and at mountains, particularly in places like New Guinea. We've got the fact that you've got massive rivers like the Mississippi and the Nile flowing into areas that, if they were really hundreds of millions of years old, or 150 million years old, with the movement of the continent, they should have deposited far, far more sediments that we find. Plus, we know that the continents themselves would have eroded away to sea level or less, over that time. So all around us is really this evidence of the young Earth. But I think the other thing that I find most fascinating, which they didn't actually mention in this chapter, are the accounts of the flood that have been preserved in so many different cultures around the world. And these have been studied by secular anthropologists and secular sociologists who have studied these records there. And we know the records predate Christian influence and so forth. And these accounts all point to this global destruction of the earth by water. And of course, the geological record itself. Again, when we look at the layers of the Earth's crust, as I pointed out before, right on the surface of the Earth cup, we have this thin layer of sedimentary rocks that are laid down underwater. And of course, the geology textbooks recognise that. It's just that they put those catastrophic events 70 million years or more old. But as we've just seen, if they're that age, with the current erosion rates, all this other evidence, we wouldn't have the structures preserved that we have today. So the current geological model that is telling everybody the Earth is so old has got to be wrong. And what we see and observe around us fits beautifully the biblical account. And this again is why I powerfully believe that we can believe the creation account. Of course, that's not to mention all the experiences of answers to prayer and the miracles that are recorded, which are first-hand evidence of the existence of a supernatural God, and the accounts of angels and these things. When we put these all together, we have a powerful picture that there is a supernatural God outside the physical system of our universe, who created us, who loves us, and most importantly, wants to have that relationship with us. And he has revealed himself to people down through the ages. And these accounts are recorded in the Bible and in Christian literature since the death of Christ. And this should give us so much assurance that we're not following cunningly devised fables. And this is why this message is so important. Why? Because it's a life and death situation. Because one day God is going to return. And those people that have chosen to follow him, that want to live according to his 10 commandments, that he gave, these simple rules for life that he gave, and choose to want to be in God's kingdom, they will be in God's kingdom. And the rest will be destroyed. This earth will be destroyed and made new again. And those who choose God, we will live forever with him to explore the beautiful universe, the beautiful new universe, and life and amazing things forever. And I think this is such a wonderful message and positive message. Remember, if you want to re-listen to these episodes, just Google or go into your search engine and enter 3abnaustralia.org.au and click on the listen button. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.